Bon après-midi tout le monde. Donc on repart
Ladies and
avec
gentlemen,
notre programme de
good afternoon.
conférences.
We're going to have the
Comme
next
je l'avais
installment of our
annoncé,
conference
nous avons
program.
un autre
As
saboteur,
I
Issam
suggested,
Nassar.
we have another saboteur with us who's called Issam Nassar.
Issam Nassar est historien.
Nassar is a historian.
Il a beaucoup écrit
He
sur l'histoire
has
sociale
written
de la
extensively
photographie
about the
en
social
Palestine.
history of
Je crois qu'il est
photography
très peu
in
traduit au français.
Palestine.
Et
He's not been
tristement est rarement
translated
invité à se présenter, à
very
s'exprimer en France.
widely
Et
into
pourtant,
French,
son
and he's very
travail a
rarely
été une
invited to
référence
speak
pour, les historiens de
in
l'art et
French.
les
But his work has
plasticiens et
been
les
a real
artistes,
reference for
palestiniens et
Palestinian
arabes.
art historians and visual artists.
Avec cette conférence, il propose de revisiter les images sur lesquelles il a beaucoup travaillé et même
going to present
son propre travail.
the images he's worked on.
La conférence sera en anglais.
So this talk will be in English with simultaneous translation into French.
Les casques, ils sont derrière. Et welcome.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rasha, and thank you for the invitation. The Arab nationalist in me wrote the paper in Arabic, and I'm supposed to present it in English. So we'll see how that will go. Hopefully, I'll manage somehow to convey some of my ideas. My theme relates to a number of issues I'm concerned with right now. They are the archive in reverse order and collective memory and nostalgia. And let me start by saying that in the last decade, or maybe decade and a half, Palestinians, perhaps after the Oslo Agreement, but with the building of institutions and the transformations that is taking place or has been taking place, suffer these days from what I would call an archive fever. Everywhere you go, in Palestine particularly, but also even outside in Palestinian communities outside, whether in exile or in the or immigrant communities abroad, the term archive seems to appear everywhere. So I've trying to think about this new development and what it means. And I am not going to focus on official archives, although they are an important element of that. Official, by that I mean archives where there are buildings and they have materials there. But I'm thinking of the new ways in which archival material is available. And let me start with the word. Let me follow Saint John, I guess. At the beginning there was the word. But my word is different from his. Mine would be collective memory, archive, and nostalgia. And let me start with the term archive. The term archive comes, I'm trying to define it basically. The term archives comes to us from Greek, to all languages, not just Arabic or English or French. And it comes from the word arche, or arche, and it is basically a term that connects two themes together. One is time. I mean, the term itself embodies the term origins or beginnings with the other concept of order. In the Greek sense, it was divine order. In other words, it connects basically time and authority. It relates to previous periods and the authority to collect artifacts and documents and images. And so in this sense, it is concerned both with memory, interpretation, and also with authority. And the interpretation and authority are very much connected. As the archivists in general are usually officials of the state or of the religious institution, or now of their own website, if you wish, or their own Facebook archive, or whatever it is. And the their role is not just limited to collecting anything, say Palestine, they collect anything related to Palestine, but an important element of their role is how to organize materials and what kind of meanings you create for those materials, artifacts that you collected. And in that sense, they exercise a great amount of power and authority that is usually through the practice of classification, because they have to come up with certain terms that all their collection fits under. And those terms reflect usually the power of knowledge, the dominant power of knowledge at the time, either in their society or in their small clique, in that sense. In other words, there is an organic relationship between preservation and authority and the power to interpret. Now, if we move on to think of the other term that relates to my talk here, I'll leave collective memory to the end. I work mostly with photographs and visual materials. And if archives historically were intended to collect government decrees and papal orders or whatever, tafsir or any other religious decree, in that sense, they were primarily historically interested in text. But recently, over the last, by now we're almost 200 years, I would say maybe 170 years, a new element was added to the archive, which is the visual element, and that relates historically to photography. And the term photography itself, as you know, also comes from Greek, and it means writing or drawing with light. So in this sense, we can also look at photography as some sort of documentary evidence, almost as a text. Not just because we have the ability to analyze it that way, but also because the archivist classifies images usually within certain categories of, this is Jaffa, this is the Muslims, this is the Christians, this is the Druze, this is the military governor or the Pasha or whatever it is. It's, the archive tells us what we should be looking at through that kind of classification in that sense. The third term I would like to also define is nostalgia. And interestingly enough, nostalgia comes to us from psychoanalysis. And it comes to us as a description of a psychological condition, a sort of this disease, if you wish, by which people were diagnosed as kind of living in the past and hanging on to something historical in some sense. But that's not what I'm gonna deal with here. I am more interested in it, in the term nostalgia, more based on the way Karl Marx dealt with it. And for Karl Marx, nostalgia was a social disease by which the bourgeoisie attempts to preserve privileges of the past through creating this tradition of this is how things are in some sense or another. In other words, according to Marx, nostalgia is connected with an attempt that is anti-revolutionary. In some sense. It is an attempt to preserve status quo in some sense or another. Now, if we try to bring these things together and think about the Palestinian condition, we'll have to start with the Nakba. The Nakba 1948 catastrophe of the disappearance of Palestine from the map and the dispersal of its people and the partitions of its territories was a major trauma in the life of the Palestinians. But the world and the Palestinians for a long time dealt with this issue from a political perspective and sometimes legal that relates to how do we solve the Palestinian problem. How do we Palestinians, how do we return Palestinians to Palestine? How do we become independent? Or how do we, Israelis, how do we get rid of them? Or how do we manage this conflict? If we're Americans, it depends. But generally speaking, Palestine as an issue has been subjected, basically taken out from the lives and the collective imagination of the people and turned into a political and legal battle in that sense. But not for the Palestinians, obviously, in general. And that's where we will be talking soon about the issue of collective memory. But in this sense, there are some problems, and I am not here critical of, I'm not trying to dismiss certain basic Palestinian concepts that I support fully, but I'm just trying to rethink the problematics that emerge out of them. And an important element in the search for solution was the UN resolution in 1949 that talked about the right of the Palestinians, the refugees, to return to their homes. With time, the idea of return becomes an important element in terms of political demands or demands for justice. And it becomes largely, with time, a slogan that is very important to the Palestinians, expressed in a variety of ways. Now, to go back to Marx, somehow, if we think about the idea of return to the past, at the time of revolution, the Palestinian revolution that wanted to build a new future, but based on this idea of return, which again, I'm not against, but I just want to talk about it so I'm not misunderstood here. Return to the past, as Marx argued, in itself is reactionary. It is an attempt to preserve a certain status quo. But in the case of the Palestinians, it became an important part of the collective memory and imagination of the Palestinians, preserved through variety of symbols and actions and commemorations and collections of Palestinian oral history, elderly generations remembering the past, etc. The term itself, return, becomes basically at once a return to a past, a glorious past, when we were free and we were in Palestine, at the same time an aim for the future that is presented by a progressive revolution that wants to change. So we have an inherent conflict in the nature of the terminology, the terminology of return and how it functions on the level of the collective memory of the Palestinians around the idea of return. It is in this context that photography and art in general became an important element, and in this sense archive as a collection of images organized in certain ways to tell a story, not just as narrative, possibility of narratives, but organized in a way, classified in certain ways to tell a story, that creates this image of the need to return back to the original place, which no longer exists, back to the same house even, or to the same orchard, or to the same village, which does not exist. And with time, it had developed into this whole idea, and these days we hear it a lot, the beautiful past, al-madi al-jamil. Of course, the level of imagination in this, and shall we use Marx again and call it false consciousness, is great. Because pre-1948 Palestine, aside from the Zionist colonization and Zionist settler activity in Palestine, was a time period and a society that was largely conservative, ruled by certain elites A'yan, connected, some of them connected historically with the Ottoman system or others who emerged during the British Mandate system. A semi-feudal society with a large number of peasantry, basically small towns, lack of water, lack of electricity, shall we call it, a rigid social classes. That is by no means a beautiful past that anyone wants to return to, in some sense. Now, how did Palestinians use, particularly the Palestinian movement and historical imagination, deal with the idea of the image? First of all, after 1948, I've noticed that in the period from, say, early 50s, all the way perhaps up to 1967 or maybe even up to 1970, we noticed that the focus in photographs and their use was primarily related to the idea of the condition of refugeedom, of being a refugee, and how life is hard. So images that came either from media to some extent, but largely came from the photographers of the United Nations Works and Relief Agency, UNRWA, that took care of the Palestinians. It played an important role in Palestinian poster, in Palestinian magazines, and even in artistic exhibitions and in documentary films and what have you. Then with the rise of the Palestinian resistance movement or Palestinian revolution, particularly in the 1970s, we start to see a different kind of image that is heavily utilized. And we find it again in posters in Palestinian magazines, and there were many of them, mouthpieces of different Palestinian groups at the time. We started to notice the emergence of the image of the Fida'i, or the freedom fighter. The new Palestinian who came out of the refugee camp now carries a gun and aims to bring back Palestine into existence. And there's so many examples of this. You know, these are just few images from here and there. Then we move into the 1980s, particularly the end of the 1980s and the post-Lebanon, the withdrawal of the PLO from Lebanon. And we noticed that the interest in collecting and utilizing visual images moves to that of the children and stones, the Intifada of 1988 or late 80s in Palestine. And that becomes a common theme, the heroic theme of the young boy or young man or woman fighting the Israeli military power with simply stones and others. And that continues practically for some time, and we see it in variety of images and situations. Now, it seems to me, I cannot prove it, but it seems to me that with the Oslo peace process in the 1990s and the transformation of Palestinians, at least some of the Palestinians, from just refugees or rebels or stone throwers into people who are trying to build institutions, we move ironically to a kind of visual imagination that is re-examining now British Mandate Palestine and Ottoman Palestine. The most popular form, I would say, in the last 15 years has been images of pre-Nakba Palestine that had become powerful. And of course, the internet played an important role in, digital distribution of these pictures. It's easy to scan them and to put them online, etc., etc. But it did not start with the internet. Actually, it started with photo books. And there are a number of photo books, including some that I myself did. So if I'm critical of anyone, I'm critical of myself here as well. But I think perhaps the most important of those books is the book by Walid Khalidi. I should have put the English version, sorry. It's the one in brown in the middle, which is entitled Before Their Diaspora, and it comes to us from the 1980s. Walid Khalidi is a Palestinian historian, perhaps one of the most important Palestinian historians of the Nakba and the post-Nakba period. And his photo book is described, the subtitle of the photo book is The Pictorial History of Palestine. And in this book, like in his historical writing, he presents us with a narrative through images. Of course, there is text, but also a narrative through images. And his narrative starts with the Ottoman Palestine with its notables and the leaders, and then it moves into the British Mandate notables. With all due respect for all of them, what we have basically is a counter move to the narrative, visual and historical narrative that dominated in the 70s, which was the narrative of, sorry, not just the 70s, even in the 50s, which basically blamed the traditional leadership for the failure of Palestine. The Mandate period Palestinian leadership for the loss of Palestine, or at least partly. And the revolutionary zeal of the time to place the Palestinian refugee and the Palestinian fighter or the stone thrower, etc., in the center of Palestinian imagination and Palestinian identity. Khalidi's book basically brings back the traditional Palestinian society in certain ways by emphasizing the significance of various personalities that played a role in the modern history of Palestine before 1948. Of course, by doing so, Khalidi not only countered the revolution, but also resurrected a history that was forgotten. And that's to his credit. I mean, I am, again, not trying to say we should forget about this part of the history, but I'm just pointing out the chronology or the how Palestinian imagination changed over time. Now, Khalidi's organization of his book came actually from the collector Wasif Johariya, who was a Jerusalemite, lived in Jerusalem until 1948, and then eventually ended up in Beirut until his death in the early 70s. Johariya left Khalidi and the Institute for Palestine Studies in Beirut 7 albums that he collected during his lifetime, photographic albums that he divided them into different periods. Palestine in the Ottoman period. In fact, first one is Jerusalem in the Ottoman period, then Palestine in the Ottoman period, then Palestine Mandate. So he has a periodization that Khalidi used largely. And Khalidi used a good deal of the pictures from that period that are in Khalidi's book actually came from the collection of Johariya in some sense or another. Now, Johariya's character is very different from Khalidi, and he was not necessarily a historian who was trying to preserve the heritage of the Palestinians as much. I mean, I'm generalizing here. Of course, he could be more than one thing, but he was also a person who wanted to show his own social status by including in his albums pictures of notables that he knew. And he usually got the pictures from those notables and they signed it for him. And the notables were not just the Palestinians. He has pictures of Ottoman leaders, of Jamal Pasha, the ruler of the Syrian region during World War I, of high commissioners, the military governor, British military governor at the time, and including other people, artists who visited Palestine, etc., etc. So Khalidi used this connection somehow. Now, is the question in my mind, did Walid Khalidi unintentionally pave the way for us to rethink of Palestine before 1948 as a civilized, highly organized society? It's possible. Of course, I cannot prove that, but his book particularly highlights, I mean, there are what I would call Orientalist elements in his book, in some sense, not fully. First of all, there is a sense of romanticization of the past, which is found in all works by Palestinians in general. Not all works, but most. But there's also this element of class and Orientalism mixed together, where in Khalidi's book, all the notables have names. You know, you go to a picture and you see the caption underneath it that this is Arif Pasha Dajjani, this is Musa Kazim Pasha al-Husseini, etc. And then when you go, and unfortunately I did not include some of those pictures, but when you have peasants, usually it's like peasants, a peasant girl from Jericho. So, you know, the classist element is somehow there. And by doing so, he might have contributed actually to this kind of revolutionary return to the image of the highly civilized Palestine. Khalidi is careful not to include, I mean, he includes some peasants, but he does not have images that you can find everywhere of camels, people with their donkeys. You know, he's keen, and I know that for a fact, on not including such images that could reduce Palestine to what 19th century European visitors saw it as, or imagined it to be, a kind of underdeveloped place in some sense or another. Now, my concern is not just with Khalidi, I'm just trying to see where did this thing start? Now, today, unfortunately, and one of the things that really bothers me the most is that how easy it is to transmit these pictures. You can receive them on WhatsApp, you can receive them on your Facebook, there are collections online, there are Palestinians who devote all their time, like Palestine Remembered is a known website, almost an archive. But the carelessness by which some of these images are treated. And now I laugh when I see them, but you know, a few years ago, it used to cause me not to sleep. Let me give you some examples. What do I mean by that? First of all, young people are collecting images and are assigning meanings to them. As someone who spent a good deal of his life trying to understand old photographs and trying to determine through a really complex process the age of each photograph and what period it refers to and things like this, I am struck by images, let's say on Facebook, that say Jaffa on September 12, 1901. I mean, unless it's written on the picture itself, there is no way we can come up with dates like this. But most images we see have dates and sometimes have names. But that's not exactly what bothers me. What bothers me is the carelessness by which some of these images are being used. And with all due respect to artists here who use such images, let's take this one. This picture is to be found on many websites, and you receive it often as one of the many images of how great the beautiful past, with captions from, you know, excited young Palestinians who will tell you, we used to have our own airline. Palestine Airways was established by the Zionists and eventually became El Al. The same thing, which is an Israeli company. The same thing relates to the Jerusalem Orchestra, which you also see all the time, which became the Jerusalem Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra. So we have so much misuse. I've seen images of the Jordanian army fighting in 1967 with captions about the Zionists about to take over Deir Yassin. I'm not saying the Zionists did not do this, but I'm saying this sloppy work is very significant because it's contributing to our collective imagination. It is contributing to our collective memory, which is being formed through these images that are reaching more people than ever before, than any book can aspire to do so, or any serious study. They are creating a massive movement that you see it everywhere about the glorious past. So at the risk of basically, sorry, this is not what I wrote, but you cannot translate from Arabic. Quoting a well-known historian who once wrote that the past is another country, I would say in the case of Palestine, the past is not just another country, it's a foreign country. But it is a foreign country with an active tourist activity, with an active tourism to it. And I think I might be able to elaborate if you have questions or comments. Thank you.
Just wanted to know, why do you say past and nostalgia is empty of foreign activity, is what you say?
Empty of?
Foreigner? The last sentence you said.
Oh, okay.
I would like you...
No, I was talking about the past. I said that the past in itself is a foreign country. And it's not empty of activity, it's full of activity from people from the present visiting that foreign country, looking at it as if it's familiar. And of course, it is partly familiar. I'm not denying that. But we are creating, in a way, a fantasy world that did not exist. And if I am to take this comment seriously, I would probably add that at some point, our program was revolutionary, looking to the future, to build a kind of new society that is free of colonization and free of oppression and based on justice. But the misuse of the past and creating this nostalgia as almost as a clinical case is, I think, harmful for our project somehow.
Thanks for the presentation, really interesting. Back to this kind of images where we keep seeing those things like the Palestine Airlines, and lately, I agree, many artists make those kind of mistakes by using those kind of images in the wrong context. Even big institutions, I remember seeing a video about a football player, and they used footage of Maccabi Tel Aviv for Palestine. For that one, for example, it was quite easy to find out the right information. But I wonder, like, there is many cases where you get some of those images and there is no way to, or at least, what's the method you think we should use as artists to know the reality and the truth of the images? Like, there is no database or archives or a figure to go and ask. Like, it's a total mess. Any recommendation?
Okay. Well, I guess there are two ways to answer this. The simple way is to do research and to try to determine, first of all, the period. And you can determine the period sometimes by looking at the picture and seeing, I don't know, if there's a store in the background or the way people dress or things like this, to try to determine. The other way is if you have the physical photograph, for example, you can determine its age through a simple process, but you need to have some expertise through the kind of paper used, through the kind of chemical process used, etc. So that's one side. And of course, doing research, historical research, through not just Google, but something, you know, more serious work. The other thing is that, and maybe that's not your question, but I'm going to use your question to talk about different ways of looking at pictures. And the picture itself has two levels, I think. A picture has a depth, and that depth is related to our interpretation on what we see in it. And that is maybe the role of the artist, the filmmaker, the painter, and the historian to try to delve into to imagine what kind of life is there and who are these characters and what's their relationship to each other. But the other level is the surface level. And I think the picture is, after all, an artifact. It's a piece of paper. And we should also sometimes distance ourselves from the deep meaning and just simply look at the artifact itself on a surface level. What kind of paper is there? What kind of process was used to take this picture? And more importantly, to think of the question of what is outside of the frame. Because after all, whoever took this picture, I mean, we don't know if there were 20 planes there or if there are 50 people sitting in a cafe nearby. Whoever took this picture decided, I'm going to capture this particular element. Now, this is not the best example, but you can imagine with picture, with people, etc. We need to have some sort of imagination to think, why did the photographer decide to take this picture and what was left out? And what was left out, our imagination can help, but our historical research, going back to newspapers on the period, we can reconstruct the sabotage, let's call it, the work of the photographer by trying to put the picture in a larger context, the image in the picture in a larger context. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Issam, can I just intervene?
Sure.
First, thank you very much. I think you've raised two a bit contradictory questions. The first, from the point of view of photography, I think we might miss the point that any people which has been displaced or any people which has been occupied always has a vision of returning to the previous situation. But let me add that this movement of going back can be a very potent force for change and for not going back in time, but for liberating their country. So I think, at least this aspect is necessary to add. But I'd like very much for you to elaborate on a point I also raised yesterday, which I think is now primordial, and that is how much memory becomes a way of really inaction. How much the idea, and I think there's nothing innocent about putting memory instead of history, and looking back, which always ends up by producing identity. And producing identity is producing difference, and rarely does producing identity look forward. And I think one very important thing to say about all those exercises is that imagining the Palestine of the future is what is missed, but more importantly, imagining how to get there is also missed. Thank you.
Yeah. Great points. And I think, let me start by saying an element that I did not elaborate on is the issue of the archive. And the projects of, all these projects of archiving are happening at a time when we are suffering from this nostalgia rather than archiving, in the more traditional sense. So that's why I'm concerned with this in some sense. Now, there is nothing wrong, and I think it is revolutionary, and it is important to think of Palestine before 48 as a normal place. And that in itself is potent. that we want to be normal people. We want to have a normal society. We want to have our feudal landlords and our working class and our lumpen proletariat and what have you. So it is one thing to present this that Palestine was just a normal country like any other country, and it could have developed in a variety of ways, which I would call, thinking of potential history. That history did not happen, but it could have developed in certain ways. And looking back at that as if it is the glorious past, the beautiful times. And that's where we are sinking into basically a problem of collective memory, because collective memory, after all, is a collection of stories, imagination, myths, tales that old grandmothers tell that are going from one generation to the other and somehow frozen in time. So, I mean, I don't know if I'm addressed your first point, but trying to think about it. Now, you are completely right that memory now, I mean, and memory is very important. Of course, I'm a historian and I'm primarily interested in unearthing memory of the past. But it is in a political movement, especially in the last maybe 2 decades with all that's happening to Palestine and the Palestinians in terms of loss of vision, in terms of complete despair. It is a way of escaping to the past, and it is a way of complete inaction. It's like people feel if I put a picture on Facebook of the old days, I'm an activist, and I've did something to Palestine. And maybe it does contribute, but yeah, it is, I agree with you. But your points are something for me to think about more precisely, rather than just answer them simply. So I hope you give me that room. Maybe next time we meet, I will have more, would have thought more about them.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. Actually, I would be very happy, very glad for this picture. I would maybe circulate it without your commentary, because it says that there was Palestinian Airways in this date. So, but I think this point is very important. Because it harms our authenticity as Palestinians, our narrative, our historical narrative, and there's another point, another picture actually of this, which is another story of the same subject. When President Abbas dedicated King Salman a copy of the Palestine Post as a very old Palestinian newspaper, which happened to be the Jerusalem Post, which is Zionist. So I think it's not. I think my question is there any way or not way? Is there someone who's trying to focus on this point to make something authentic for these pictures? Thank you.
Can you elaborate? I did not understand the last part. What do you mean by someone? Is there like an institution or?
Institution, people, center, someone maybe
Yeah.
trying to classify pictures.
Yeah. Well, there are several attempts now at creating archives, including the Palestinian Museum, including the Yasser Arafat Foundation has a photographic archive. I mean, it's still beginning. There used to be maybe it's still around, the PLO archive and Institute for Palestine Studies. There are other local attempts in Al-Fahm, for example, there's one person in Nazareth who calls himself the Nazareth Archive, but it's actually just him in his kitchen where he has his pictures, which is great. I'm not saying it's not. But on the point of this picture, I understand that the Palestinians, with the loss of Palestine, and my generation that lived abroad, in the 1970s or 80s, it was really hard for us to tell people I'm Palestinian, because often a stupid American will tell you, no, you're not. There's no such thing as Palestine. Because there is this essentialization that it's all Israel. And perhaps by showing that even the Israelis, before they were Israelis, were using the term Palestine. In fact, if we go back historically to the end of World War I, we find some Palestinian activists, Arab activists in Palestine, who were keen on fighting the term Palestinian because they associated it with the Zionist project. They would say, no, we're Arabs, or as Khalil Sakakini wrote, no, we're Southern Syrians. And let's not call ourselves Palestinians because that's what the Zionists want to do. So, I mean, it has, I guess, political implications to highlight that even the Zionists use the term Palestine. But that's one thing, and imagining our past as completely manufactured, I mean, all imagination is manufactured, but at least not on some solid basis, is rather problematic, I think, at that time, at this time. But there are organizations, in other words, there's the Arab Image Foundation in Beirut. There are people who are trying to collect and verify the information. They're not always successful. I mean, sometimes people just, you know, imagine that, you know, I mean, if you go to the Library of Congress, for example, and you put in their computer Jaffa, you get pictures of Jerusalem most of the time, because Jaffa Gate is Bab al-Khalil. So, you know, the classification is not always accurate. Now, if you know that, it's obvious. But if you don't know that, then you will place pictures of Jerusalem as if it is Jaffa. So, you know, there are problems that require creative thinking, I think. And there are people who are doing this work, and some of them are here.
Thank you, Issam. Very interesting on the future. But I would like to go back to the books you talked about, which you put together, including Walid Khaldi's and Leah Sambar's. I think nostalgia is not necessarily the only reason for the choice that Walid Khaldi made of the pictures he chose, because obviously he was trying to answer the visual impression people in the West had because of the Zionist way of portraying Palestine that you find in Leah Sambar's book, which are peasants, Bedouins, empty spaces, which was the illustration of the famous slogan, a land without people, for a people without a land.
Correct.
So Walid Khaldi was the first attempt at showing that in the imagery that the Zionists produced of people who were nomads or peasants only, there was also a middle class. He really went after pictures, not only of the collection of Joharieh, but also of family pictures.
Correct.
And of Khalil Ra'ad's collection, which is at the Institute, to show that in Palestine, there was a middle class too. There were urban people, not only rural people, because in the fight on the image of Palestine, it was important to show that there was also this middle class. So I think nostalgia is at the time, maybe today, with young people in Palestine working in art circles, you find more nostalgia. But I don't think that Khalidi had nostalgia. Khalidi had a counter-narrative, visual counter-narrative to the narrative the West was using, which was produced by the Zionists and that Sambar speaks about very well in his own book.
Actually, you're right. And my intention was not to present a critique of Khalidi as someone who fell into nostalgia. In fact, his book is called The Pictorial History of the Palestinians, and it was published in English, French, and Spanish, along with Arabic, and went through many volumes and many reprints. Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you on this. What I was trying to do is to think about the kind of nostalgia we have today, and where did it come from? It doesn't mean that Khalid's intention was that, but I think we are now following that line. And I would not put Sambar, even though I put his book here, I would not put him in this group because his book is actually a pictorial history of the Palestinians, not only up to 1948, but it includes the 67 war, the revolution, Lebanon, Jordan. You know, it attempts to cover more than a century of the history of Palestinians with pictures. So it's a step forward. But I'm thinking that my point is that these kinds of works established sort of narrative, and particularly Khalidi, more so than anyone else, established a narrative that we are captive to today, not necessarily in a negative way, but it had these negative ramifications with the new generation, with the easiness of the internet and the easiness of creating virtual archives.
Hi, Issam.
Hi.
I came across from the Library of Congress, the Madison Collection, specifically the Jaffa pictures. I never understood the photographers that took those images prior, I think, 48. But it showed Jaffa as an industrialized area, populated, and I never understood because the Zionist movement at the time was not trying to export that image. Yani the image of the Arab was always, like you said about Khaldi, is Bedouin, no man's land. So I was always curious about the Madison Collection and who took those images and why did they take Jaffa to look urbanized, populated, sophisticated, let's say, in its simplicity. This is one. My other question is more personal. Nostalgia, for me, breaks my legs. Sorry, I had to write it down because I don't know how to gather my ideas. It's a lot. I'm all over the place. So it cripples me. Also, I believe even the future, we speak about the future with reference to the return, it's almost like nostalgia to the future. And you have the nostalgia to the past, and in the future moment for us, the return, which is also linked to the past. And I feel the archive is greatly relevant if the present moment is lived. Considering in the case of Palestine, that the present moment is forbidden, both geographically for many Palestinians, physically, mentally, and all that. I'm trying in the past 3 days, to be honest, to understand why I'm so hungry for an image of Palestine. Actually, I was waiting for you to use the present. And I was also waiting in the other talks for them to use the word present. It was always future and past. And if you go to the street today, to Palestinians in refugee camps, to Egyptians, no one knows anything about the present. So the present becomes very relevant. Yani, I'm looking at the past, and today you have a generation of people, and even you. If you're not privileged to be able to enter Palestine, you know nothing, actually. So I'm curious about the present in the terms of a historian. Yani, the historian is always looking at the past, but the present is a forbidden moment for us.
Yeah. Well, historians wait for the present to become a distant past to be able to deal with it or to even think about it. But I think, you know, partly the terrible conditions through which we live, or most people live, I mean, Syrians, Egyptians, others, you know, makes us somehow turn to the past in order to look for some glimpse of hope. And that in itself is problematic, but also an escape, a way to escape from our terrible present. But let me start first with the Madison. The Madison Collection comes to us from the missionary group that established itself in Jerusalem in the 1880s called the American Colony. And the first photographer of this group was a Swedish called Larsson, thank you, Lars Larsson. And he taught others to, within the group, And among those students would be Eric Madsen himself. And a number of Palestinians who became photographers also learned photography in the, what was called the photographic department of the American colony. In the beginning, most of them, I mean, they functioned in different capacities. In the beginning, they were taking images of the Bible land and trying to understand the biblical text through the land. They thought that, you know, in order, not just them, that there was a trend in the late 19th century European thought that the Bible has been misunderstood. In order to understand the Bible, you need to actually go look at the land. It will reveal things for you. And that took dimensions that are rather interesting, although weird. For example, the documentations by another group, the Mahmoud knows, the Palestine Exploration Fund. I remember going there and finding massive numbers of pictures of fig trees. And at the end, you discover that because Jesus talked about the fig trees, someone went to Palestine in the 19th century with a camera, documented all sorts of fig trees in order to rethink that one sentence in the Bible. So there was that element. But then this group became more and more involved in local society in Ottoman period. And from that group, a photographer came out with the name of Whiting or Whiting, John Whiting, who was actually hired by the Ottomans to, well, technically he was hired by the Ottoman Red Crescent to document the activity of the Red Crescent in the Palestine-Sinai front. So they started to do commercial work for the Ottoman army, the Ottoman Fourth Army in Palestine. And that continued, so they became more involved with British officials on all sorts of levels as photographers. I'm going to skip the elements of their personal connections. In fact, Whiting admitted later on that he was a British spy, spying on the Ottomans through these pictures, using his position. But anyway, and eventually, I forgot the date, it must have been in the early 30s, they decided to open up a shop to sell photographs. And that meant that they were selling photographs for tourists and pilgrims. So, you know, the typical Dome of the Rock, often misidentified as the Mosque of Omar, or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or other places in Palestine, Nazareth, Bethlehem, Hebron, other places. So they became more and more involved. And at some point, Madsen would emerge, and Madsen became very interested in, he will inherit the American colony. In fact, the shop will change name and becomes Madsen's shop. So he inherited the entire collection. So not all the pictures that we see in the Library of Congress were actually taken by him, but they were taken by others, including the brothers Albina were two photographers, Hanna Safia, the Palestinians who worked with the group. And for that commercial enterprise, they started to go outside of Palestine. Madsen actually went to Iraq and documented monuments in Iraq and documented life. So, I mean, it was a commercial project. Now, why particularly did he choose to document Jaffa? We will never know, even though he has his notebooks, which I try to navigate through, but, you know, they're written in handwriting that's really hard to, I mean, at some point, I'm sure someone will do that study to see if it explains what he was trying to do. But in a way, they were not connected with the Zionist project. They were more embedded, shall we call it, with the Arab society and with the Arab notables and elites and aristocracy, and they were proud of that. So part of that pride was to photograph. Many of the images we see here probably were taken by them. Where are we? Sorry, like images like this probably were taken by them, and it was not just because they documented who Faid al-Alami was. They probably wanted to give Faid al-Alami a gift of his own photograph. So they were involved in that sense, and I would think, I don't know, I mean, I know the pictures you're talking about, soap factories and orange industry, basically, but I'll try to find out more for you. We'll be in touch about this.
Thank you very much, really, Issam, for this fantastic presentation. And again, you always reveal, new aspects of the importance of archives and photography in Palestine. I really liked your definition of photographs, or particularly old photographs, as an artifact, or I would like to say an object which could be also used in a museum to tell a certain story, as much as an archaeological, ethnographic object would tell the story. So in that respect, if I may speak on behalf of the Palestinian Museum, that we are trying at the moment really to use this medium, photography and archives, in order to tell a story of a people, a story of a land. And for us, we think archives, whether they are old photographs, documents, but also audiovisual material as part of telling of that story of a people, of a culture, and in order to reconstruct the past from the deepest past until modern times. So for us, we really give quite a lot of importance for archives, and particularly that photography can be complemented by other type of archival materials, such as documents and audiovisual materials, so that these photographs, even if they are intended to be for a propaganda, whether it's Zionist or otherwise, can be reinterpreted, can be recurated in order to tell the real story. Exactly like what you did recently with your exhibition in the Brown University, where you took all those old photographs of Palestine of late 19th century, early 20th century, and recurate them and reinterpret them. I think this is where we can actually overcome the problem of the misuse of these photos. So I think we really have to do quite a lot of research when it comes to these old photographs. A lot of research in order to tell the real story behind these pictures.
Well, thank you, Mahmoud, and thank you for the compliment about the exhibition. I agree, and I think we need to reclaim the image, to decolonize the image. But I also think that archives and museums should also, going back to the artifact, when you think of an artifact, you don't only think of, the photograph has an image, so you delve into the well, or the woman by the well, or etc. But in itself, as an artifact, it has a history of a craft. Who produced it? Where did these chemicals come from? What kind of social, economic, labor relations? It's so fascinating to find out that photographers in Jaffa and Beirut and Jerusalem were connected together. They were selling each other images. They were, who consumed these images? There are all sorts of other questions that I think can also enlighten us more about the history of Palestine, not just what the image itself suggests to us, but its role as an artifact, as a product, as something that is sold, distributed, and used. Why did my grandmother take this picture and put it in the album? And why did she put it after that picture? What kind of story is she trying to create? So I think there are all sorts of elements that we yet have to tackle, or maybe we started tackling. But thank you for that.
I'm afraid we have to stop. But Issam is here. You can grab him. You can ask him questions, because we need to give time people to buy tickets for the screening. Je suis désolée, mais on doit s'arrêter pour vous donner le temps.